the recording now. And it is my great pleasure to introduce Maurice Glucksman to you all, who has a fascinating talk that has material directly on the subject of our group, but also on multiple modeling methods and actually trying to get to how do we have impact on policymakers. So there's just a very great opportunity for us to first have a really interesting talk and then have a really lively discussion afterwards. So Maurice, take it away.
Thank you, Wayne. And before I get any further, thank you for all your help preparing for this talk, because you and I spent, I don't know, at least a couple of hours together over on three separate occasions while you were on holiday in Mexico. So suffering from COVID, allegedly, it looked like you were having a good time. So really appreciate all the input you've had. And also just to introduce this gentleman to my right, Costas Triantis, who's a professor at Virginia Tech, and I happen to be related to him because he's my wife's brother. But he's also been one of my mentors through my career, and has given me an awful lot of guidance in how to think about modeling, and particularly how to think about impact. So he's well primed to give some comments on the impact side, I think. Let me share my screen and we can jump straight in. Okay, so I'm just going to make this a little bit bigger. I'm not going to drop into a presentation mode here because I want you to see all the stuff on the left as we go. This is implications from investigating surges and collapses of depression in the pandemic. And what I'm hoping is we're going to spend just a little bit of time talking about the work that I've done, but much more time talking about your reaction to it, and your suggestions and ideas for how to get from the modeling work to some sort of what I think should be an urgent call to action to do something about the stuff that we discovered here. So at a high level, this is the discovery. And the title of the chart is "Dominoes Are Falling Over Now." We've had several waves of COVID-19 infections. That has accumulated to a large number of people suffering from long COVID. And in the UK, the Office of National Statistics published a report yesterday saying that 2 million people in the UK, which is 3.1% of the population, is affected by long COVID symptoms. That's a lot of people. I've been doing some work with Nathaniel Osgood and Jenny Basran in Saskatchewan, who are running a long COVID study right now. And the conversion rate from long COVID to long COVID-induced depression is 60% in their study. So it's a lot of people. And there are lots of other things that are happening from long COVID, but this is a big one. And one of the reasons for looking at this with dynamic modeling is the direct consequences of long COVID-induced depression. They include lost productivity, escalation of healthcare costs for the people who are trying to help people with depression. There's a big difference between how long somebody actually lives if they end up having episodic major depression. And there's the work that I've been doing here implies that certain locations or either geographic or social groups can end up in a locked-in state, kind of like the opioid addiction crisis, because depression is actually contagious and it's episodic. So if lots of people have it, they can transmit it to others. It works like an infectious disease, and an epidemiology around that, and it can repeat through your lifetime. So I'm going to come back to this later, but this is an example of a type of communication that I think might actually be understandable to people who have to make decisions about what to do. So this is the sort of pithy, simple summary of the work, which is, I think, objectively rather complicated. So I'm going to march quickly through first the survey. I'll come back to observations and acknowledgement at the end. A survey that was done with the NHS, some background on the depression data, how the hybrid modeling was done with geographic data science, agent-based modeling, and system dynamics, some insights from the work. Then I'm going to show you the survey results about what people thought about depression before they saw the presentation and how that compares to the insights from the presentation. I'll show you something about the models, something about what's going on in Saskatchewan, which I believe is pretty important, and then some implications. And leave a lot of time for discussion. That's why it's got a big star next to it. Just to orient you a little bit, this is the study area that I've been looking at. It's a few neighborhoods in London in the United Kingdom where I live. And this is Greater London. It's a much bigger area than my study area. The study area is Westminster, Camden, and Islington, parts of each of those. And it's split up into neighborhoods that are called Middle Super Output Areas, or MSOA. They have about between 6,000 and 12,000 people in them. And the shading on this map is variations in depression. Light shading is low and dark is high. And you can see there are huge variations across the map. And this is a pattern and a characteristic that is happening everywhere in the UK and across London. It's not atypical at all. Before the pandemic, this is what the inflows to depression prevalence looked like and the outflows. The inflows are on the left and the outflows on the right. So if you were looking at this as a stock and flow set of data, this would be the rate in and the rate out. You can see it's pretty stable. Westminster's a little more volatile and varying than England as a whole, and lower on average than England as a whole, but quite stable, not much going on. At this point in a presentation to the NHS, the National Health Service here in the UK on April 4th had a pretty sophisticated audience of about 70 people who understand challenges faced by the UK in the pandemic pretty well, including mental health. And I gave them this survey to see what their thinking was before we got into the analysis. So 5 questions, and just as an experiment, you might want to write down your answers. And it's A, B, or C to what happened to demand for mental health services during the pandemic, what happened to depression prevalence. Both of those would be more or less or both. And which areas would suffer the worst sustained impact over the next decade. So low vulnerability, which would mean people who maybe are pretty well resourced, are not suffering from financial distress or disease or something like that, and all the way up to high vulnerability where those stresses are very high, or medium vulnerability in the middle. How long will this last? Is the impact of the pandemic going to be a couple of years after it's all over? Maybe double that at 4 years or much longer? And what is the estimated economic impact from long COVID-induced depression? And the reason I put the economics in here is very often decision makers are driven by this. So we're trying to connect the analysis to the things that actually cause decision makers to do stuff. And so, what do you think is this? So this is just long COVID-induced depression, a consequence of people getting long COVID and then later on getting depressed. And is it 10 billion, 50 billion, or 200 billion? That's in the UK, where we have 67 million people, and the whole economy is about 3 trillion per year, just to put it in context. Now, so if you've made a note of those, I'm going to dive straight into the answer to the first question. This is a map of the United States, and I'm sorry for the colors. I didn't choose them. It's just a link to a survey done by McKinsey, and the survey was conducted in the middle of 2021, or month by month, the middle of 21, and this is just tracking the variations in mental health, demand for mental health services in 20 cities across the U.S. And what you can observe by looking at this data is very dynamic. There are some consistent patterns, but not everywhere. You know, Denver has seemingly shot up. At some point, it was up 100%, and it seems to have locked in to a very high level. Other areas have collapsed and then bounced back. Other areas, stable, not much happening. So it's very different in each city, and clearly geography matters. And it looks like there are noticeable differences between what was happening before the pandemic versus after, and in some cases those differences look like they might persist. So what's going on here as a hypothesis? Some of the possible dynamics are theory, if you will, is I'll come on to contagion in a moment. That's a big part of this. Possibly there are threshold effects happening where the contagion might be flipping from virtuous to vicious situation. Maybe some saturation. So many people are depressed, you can't depress anybody else. Maybe some delays, the perception of pandemic severity, recoveries, policy impacts, and oscillations, and possibly state changes where we get a lock-in type situation. And some of the parameters that might be affecting this are the vulnerability to changes. I talked about that in the survey, and differing pandemic shocks or triggers of new cases and recoveries. So I'm going to show you first the evidence for contagion, so you can understand that. It comes from a study called the Framingham Heart Study, which is a really important study that lasted 35 years in Framingham, Massachusetts. And they were looking for evidence of causes of heart disease, and depression was one of the causes they investigated. They also were quite good about how they drilled back into what might have been the causes of the causes, and they looked at social networks and business contacts and so on. And Rosenquist, Fowler, and Christakis went back through this data and tried to look for evidence of causes of depression, and they found that clusters, people formed clusters. This is a topological map of the relationships in this study here on the left. And you can see the darker areas are clusters, and that's kind of evidence of smoking gun of contagion. And it turns out that when they did the analysis on the full data set, you get a relationship like this on the right. The more people who feel depressed in your network, the more likely it is you're going to get depressed yourself. And it's a pretty strong relationship. It saturates eventually, but it's quite significant. So this is the next thing I'm going to show you is something that I did at the end of the work, because I was trying to figure out how to explain what I discovered I was doing a geographic data science thesis at Birkbeck, the University of London, and I was trying to explain to people reading the thesis, what has happened. And Wayne suggested I should, for this audience, I should show a Venn diagram and compare it to a Silico diagram. Silico is a software package that is very similar. You can see it's based on the same two stocks of well and depressed, and there's just flows from well to depressed, and then they cycle back after they recover. So we have the same structure here, and there's some influences. We have a reinforcing feedback when contagion kicks in. The more people that are depressed, the higher depression prevalence is, and the more likely it is that somebody's going to get depressed. There's as more people get depressed, you kind of run out of people to get depressed. So that's a counteracting feedback there. And as people recover, that's another counteracting feedback. So this is quite a simple dynamic system, but it can produce some pretty shocking results. And I'll just show you some of the detail on the results. So this is the same diagram. Just varying two parameters here. One is a shock to the number of people moving from well to depressed, up and down, and there it is. And it's just one size of shock, up about 80% or down 80%. And then I've got some variations in the sensitivity to that shock using a time constant. So people either react fast or slow depending upon how vulnerable they are. And what happens is the depression prevalence for the relatively low vulnerable areas tends to get kicked by the shock and then goes back to where it was before. But for the high vulnerability areas, it just stays permanently up there. And that's the lock-in effect that we're talking about. And that's a key risk for depression post-pandemic long COVID-induced depression. There's some other stuff we can talk about if we have time, but I'm just going to zip through this and say, I did a similar analysis trying to replicate the results in Dallas, Seattle, Denver, and Los Angeles. That produced kind of chaotic implied variations, totally different in every city. And if you use the same model to see what happens to Dallas, Denver, Los Angeles, and Seattle, it very quickly goes to a lock-in with a particular assumption about vulnerability, which is kind of scary. So, do we want twice as many people depressed after the pandemic as we had before? Probably not. Now just some more data. This is the actual results from surveys by the Office of National Statistics over here in the lower right, and UCL, University College London, which where I was studying was connected to. They surveyed, they created an index of the levels of depression and anxiety during the pandemic. If you try to match these two surveys up in timing, these surveys were done at non-standard intervals and over non-standard lengths of time. So the width of these columns represents the length of time of the survey went on, and the location matches up with this. You can see they match pretty well. But the ONS study missed a huge surge of depression at the beginning of the pandemic, almost up to 30% of the population, which is a heck of a lot. Then it collapsed down by about half to about 18, back up to 24, back down to 19. So we get this roller coaster going on through the pandemic. And that's the pattern that I've used to benchmark the models. The next thing is, this is data from a study done in Saskatchewan on long COVID mental health outcomes. This has become much more detailed. I'm not going to show you that because you'd be overwhelmed by it. But Nathaniel Osgood and Jenny Basran are working on this, and they're doing some really fantastic work on collecting empirical data for what's going on. And here you can see depression is 61% of people who have self-identified as long COVID. It's double the rate of people that have either got identified as having have had COVID or not COVID, which are roughly the same. So it's a big impact. Now, put this in perspective, how this has been changing over time. This is the flow in to people who are getting long COVID. So it was relatively stable for a while last year, and then it's just started growing pretty quickly through the beginning of this year. And if you translate that into a trend, I've got a simulation that produces these curves. It's looking like it's tracking to be somewhere between 3.5% to 5% of the population by the end of this year, which is a lot. So what did I do to work with this data? I had three different types of models. One was just a simple geospatial regression to try and look for evidence of vulnerability, because vulnerability is something that is generally understood to be important in determining triggers of depression, and those variations produced a multivariate regression that indicated vulnerability in the areas. I'll say right now I don't have a lot of confidence in this because, and I'll show you why. But it's an indicative. It shows that when you have different higher or lower levels of stress, that the trigger cases of depression, very, very different things can happen. So I use that vulnerability across this map and use the system dynamics model to estimate some parameters that were key to setting up this agent-based simulation in the middle. Just get an idea of what causes depression. Most of the time, it's triggered by a change in circumstances. We had a heck of a big change in circumstances in the pandemic, and it's still continuing because now we've got lots of people with long COVID, and their circumstances are changed. So some of the drivers relate to long-term experiences like childhood experiences, but a lot of it is things that are erupting in your life and changing the way you are feeling. This is the full list. It's a lot, and it boiled down to 5 factors out of an exploratory regression that seem to explain the vulnerability, which is fuel poverty, an index of multiple deprivation, serious mental illness, learning disabilities, and hospital stays for alcohol-related harm. These are all proxies for various things that cause stress and could trigger it. If you do that multivariate regression, you get something that looks like this. This is a standard geospatial analytical package called Geodom for producing these graphs. If you look in detail at some of the regressions, they're pretty suspect. I mean, some of these look like shotgun blasts, and you could pass the line any way you like through them. So I have some concerns about the validity of this, but let's put that aside for now. So having done that and gotten this vulnerability index, the next step was to actually create the agent-based model. But once I did that, I realized I didn't have any way to estimate the parameters, so I went back to system dynamics and using a description by the National Institute of Clinical Excellence, found this narrative description of basically a conveyor belt, people moving from well to short-term depressed to long-term depressed. And it says 75% recover within a year. And of the 25% who don't recover, 60% recover within 2 years. And then of those who don't recover at that point, 40% after 4 years, and so on, until you end up with 27% of the people who'd never really recover. And crucially, those who have an episode of long-term depression, they end up with having a median of 4 episodes in a lifetime. So you're at much higher risk of a repeat episode if you've had depression before. And that's a median for the whole population. Younger people arguably might have 20 episodes. So younger people are potentially much more seriously at risk here. If you translate this narrative into a dynamic model, it looks like this. I'm not going to go through it. Happy to share this model if you want to play with it. But it's just a conveyor belt. These are the stages of depression. These are the recovery stocks, and people cycle back through it. Crucially, there's a stock of immune here, and I'll come back to that. It's very important. And if you summarize it, it looks like this. And this is a quantification, if you will, that the setup is produce a stable model like the data I showed you before, and then introduce the pandemic and see what impacts you have to cause the model to follow the data, which is what you've seen earlier. And so those impacts look like this. And one, you discover some interesting things, like 20% of the population has been depressed before. That's not something that's measured anywhere or reported anywhere, but it's a high risk group and arguably should be recorded. This is the sort of data that they're collecting in Saskatchewan, and it's quite unusual to do that. And it's driven by an understanding of the dynamics of an epidemiology of depression. So using parameters from this model, created an agent-based model, and the agents correspond to the stocks in the system dynamics model. The immunes are there, but you can't really see them. Wells are green. People are short-term depressed are kind of purple colored. Long-term depressed, they've turned black, and pink is the ones who've had a case of long-term depression and recovered. You can see just by inspection that there's many more green people here. First part of the pandemic, which is this peak here, lots of short-term depressed, and long-term, lots of people who are at risk of relapse. And we really don't want to be here. This is a bad situation, and there's a huge amount of variation here. So and you can see the performance over time, lots of surges and collapses. Costas is showing me the clock. I've got 2 minutes left, but probably about 20 minutes more slides, so I'm going to race now. If you want to learn more about how the model works, there's some slides here you can look at. This is very important. Here I've done a scenario analysis with different levels of long COVID-induced depression. So on the second row is the levels of depression prevalence in each area, all 30 areas across here, 10 in each of these charts. And this is the expected level of long COVID-induced depression based on the data we have so far. On top is no long COVID-induced depression. At the bottom two are 50% more and 200% more. So this is this is genuinely uncertain right now. We don't know how big it's going to get, but it could actually get this big. And what happens when you vary this is you end up with a different outcome. So the chaos that's happening partly because of the contagion evolves from this stage pre-pandemic in 2019 to these. This is the no long COVID-induced depression expected 50% more and 200% more. And you can see the hotspots move around the map. So you're looking at a situation from a health policy perspective where this is telling you something about where you might need to intervene to stop depression from escalating to very high levels. Yet another insight from this is that's my timeout. So I'll just spend one more minute here. This is an ordinal ranking of vulnerability index that I talked about earlier, and on the right is the relative levels of depression in the areas, and given the existence of contagion, you would expect that the lower vulnerability areas would tend to perform better. But what I was also expecting is a mirror image of this on top, and it doesn't happen. The worst areas are the ones in the middle. And finally, when you look at what's happened here, it's a handful of the areas have locked in to a much higher level of depression, and that's a serious concern. Why is it serious? Because it's a lot of economic impact. The long COVID-induced depression, this is splitting it between the impact from lost productivity and lost days of work, which is about 2 billion in this case for the UK, about 95 billion for the health services, and 200 billion for early death from depression. If you add it up as a whole for the pandemic, it's a £1 trillion impact, which is the functional equivalent of a major long-term depression, economic depression. So just to show you what is the perception of the folks who took the survey, the only one that they agreed with the analysis was it was going to take a long time to recover from this. They weren't clear about whether, what depression was going to be up, down, or both. They all believed, as I did before I did this, that probably the high vulnerability areas were the most important, but it turns out the medium vulnerabilities are sitting on some sort of a knife edge. Last thing I'm going to show you is something about Saskatchewan, because I really think these guys deserve a lot of credit for what they're doing and deserve some support. This is Saskatchewan. It's the middle of Canada, and they're at the University of Saskatchewan at Saskatoon, and they've built a very robust information framework and relationships with the Saskatchewan Health Authority. Jenny Basran is the Chief Information Officer of the Saskatchewan Health Authority, in addition to being a geriatrician and a professor at the university there. And by doing some very good modeling and combining it with machine learning and some very refined and clever reports and dashboards, all underpinned by collecting the right data, they've actually been able to do some pretty important work and influence the course of the pandemic there. And this is the sort of output that they get. They're using some advanced machine learning methods that allow them to react very quickly. Literally, they can update, they can assess new data coming in, update all their models in a matter of hours, which it compares to most of the folks that I've interacted with. We're looking at timescales of a couple of weeks, and this allows them to really form policy and analyze what is a fast-changing situation in real time. I think the impact of machine learning has been profound. We can talk about it in the discussion. Some of the insights we can talk about in the discussion, but this is where we've ended up. We're just about to enter this phase, and it looks like we have a window of about 18 months to do something about this. So this is kind of a call to action about how to hopefully influence a better path. So I think a little bit over time. Sorry about that. Open it up for comments, discussions, questions, and we can dive into any bit of this that you like.
I'll just say, Maurice, that was obviously a ton of stuff thrown at us at once, but I think you were effective in at least getting us aware of what you've been doing at a certain level. And I'd really love to throw it open for questions. I just wanted to say thank you for, you put a lot of energy into making sure this talk would be interesting to us, and we appreciate that.
Well, thanks, Wayne. Thanks for the opportunity, and I hope there's one or two questions, or at least fire away.
In the meantime, before anyone asks a question, do you mind going to your system dynamics model, please? Or just have it up so I can take a look at it. Thank you.
Sure. The one that the high level summary, or the more
do you have a system dynamics model even prior to this slide?
A little two-stock one?
Yeah, a little too simple.
Oh, the really simple one. Okay. Yep.
Start simple, bro. Thank you.
You can go to the previous slide if you want. Yeah. This is... So Ross, did you have a specific question?
Not off here. Just want to look at it while others.
Okay, you can have it if you want to. It's Silico is free to use. If you give me your email, you can play with it if you want to.
No worries.
I have it was a lot of information.
Yeah.
It is. I'm just thinking about other shocks that we have experienced historically, and so I'm thinking about like 9/11 or even the 1918 pandemic, or the world wars 1 and 2, the stock market crash. and the depression. I mean, we've had some like really big things, right? And so I guess, have we seen this kind of lock-in and increased prevalence of depression previously? Or is this something that
Yes,
is?
yes. The answer is yes. It's happened before. Yeah, I don't think we've ever had enough data to analyze it in this level of detail. One of the things that happened during the pandemic, which was unprecedented, is data became freely available and almost in real time. That has changed our understanding of what's going on. So there are some lessons to be learned, and there's a lot of literature on prior disasters, but it tends to be anecdotal as opposed to data driven.
So I don't want to keep anybody else from asking questions because I've had a chance to dive into this material a little bit more than most of us here. But you talked about impact, and I'm curious. I know that, at least for me, I'll speak for myself, but I don't think many of us have had some soul searching about the fact that we really, really, really want to have impact, but we don't know quite what to do. And I think you've got some ideas on how do analysts, people like us who are mostly modelers and analysts, how do we up our impact factor with people who actually make decisions?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I'll be the first one to admit, through most of my career, I have been struggling with that one because I spent a good almost a couple of decades as a management consultant, part of the time with McKinsey, and then became an equity analyst and had to convince investors using models about what they should do. And generally it was hit or miss. You develop a model, you understand it really well, but if you show a causal loop diagram or a stock and flow diagram to an investor, they'll kick you out because they just want to know what the message is. And it often boils down to something very simple like this. And then if you get them interested, you can talk more about the detail. But if you get beyond a very high level motivator of decisions that's more complicated than this, then you're walking on thin ice and probably going to fall through.
So we had this discussion last night, and we talked about a number of things. I think to a large extent, we don't communicate very effectively in the communities that we're engaged in. I think that's part of the problem. The second thing that we talked about, Maurice and I talked about, was the fact that in our audience, we should have people that actually make decisions. And how do we engage them? How do we get them in the room? And that's really essential question. Now, part of our research is focused on having the decision makers in the room as part of the modeling process. But the question, this kind of impact is really significant. We would love to have people in government, high up in government, really engaged at some level. How do we get that engagement? And I think that is a really difficult nut to crack. Now, this whole analysis, and Maurice and I were talking about, is based on certain assumptions, certain fundamental assumptions. And so one of the things that we try to do is people that focus on modeling is making sure that the assumptions are reasonable for the phenomena that we're trying to capture. And so it's a catch-22. You want to make sure that you're sounding the alarm bell, and you're hoping that you're not incorrect in doing so. Because then if you're incorrect in doing so, then you can do more damage than good in terms of the impact that this would have on modeling in general. But Wayne, to your point, I think it's extremely important to get access to the people that are actually making decisions. And how do we do that as a community is an open issue.
Yeah, and just a side comment. We do have a model that is working really well in Saskatchewan. They've integrated modeling with information architecture, and they've had a lot of practice with the Saskatchewan Health Authority to make them comfortable with the way that they're approaching these issues. And Jenny Basran is a genuinely high impact, very engaging presenter who has a good understanding of the analytics. You kind of need it. It's really helpful. I don't say it's the only way to do it, but it's really helpful to have a champion like that, who speaks the right language, knows the people who are making decisions personally. And, in addition to having a presentation with them, you can go off and have dinner with them and say, hey, look, instead of going to this ribbon cutting ceremony on the bridge, please come and spend a little time with me in the engine room of this, so we can get you comfortable with what we're finding. So it's a different model than I think is typically used. Typically we're off using models in a boiler room somewhere, and just periodically surfacing, putting our heads above the parapet and saying, "Hey, I found something." So
Yeah.
and that just doesn't cut it when you have politics interfering and very rapid messaging that may misinterpret your findings and so on.
I
Yeah,
just want to make
in
a
my
comment.
work,
Naveed had some success in getting the administration of Virginia Tech to listen to him. So I'm not quite sure how he accomplished this, but when the provost came up here in Northern Virginia a couple of weeks ago, he acknowledged Naveed in the room, and so I don't know what kind of magic Naveed threw into the mix, but he can share. At least he got the attention of people at the university level to listen to him. So,
Gary, go ahead. You've been trying to get in there.
No, I was just saying, going to say in my work that champion, as Maurice used that term, really is key. It's somebody who understands the modeling. They may not be modelers themselves, but they understand the modeling well enough and are deeply enough engaged in the organization, either working for them or having a history with them, that they can serve as a bridge between the modeling and the organization. And I've found that key, that when that person is there, you tend to have a lot more impact. But I was going to ask a different question about sort of the bigger depression picture relative to COVID. It seems like there are three groups of people. There are the people who develop long COVID and become depressed as a result. There are people who were previously depressed, who, even if they don't develop long COVID, are affected by the isolation, by the uncertainty, by all the psychological effects of COVID, and their depression may worsen. And so I think there's a severity dimension as well. And then people who weren't depressed before don't develop long COVID, but become depressed as a result of the psychological strains of living through different waves of COVID. And so those people all are part of a base of depressed people that varies over time. And how do you consider that larger picture in terms of what's driving depression, especially through that contagion effect?
Yeah, so you just described the survey that Data Osgood is doing.
I'm sorry?
I said you just described the survey that Nathaniel Osgood is doing in Saskatchewan.
Okay, so they're looking at
into all those pre-existing conditions, whether or not somebody's got COVID or not, and what is the outcome. So he's breaking it down that way, and I think it's very important to do that. I haven't done that, but it is very important, and that's one of the amazing things about what they're doing is they're really looking at this from every angle and trying to drill into these nuances, and it's not just in an aggregate picture of Saskatchewan. It's literally at neighborhood levels and looking at the differences between neighborhoods, which can be massively different, as you've seen here. So that's why I think what they're doing there is so fascinating and important, and the survey that they're working on now in Saskatchewan is already expanding to Alberta and I believe British Columbia, and if their track record is anything to go by, it'll be across Canada very soon. So it's really important work, and it draws on their success in the pandemic, and they're using models with that kind of level of disaggregation to try to understand
Great.
the real effects.
Say, Deb, you made some comments in the chat. I was wondering, I'd like to invite you to maybe speak your ideas on how to have more impact, and let's talk about how do we do that. Actually, what you suggested in chat.
Yeah. So I agree with Gary. So it takes a village, right? So there are different people with different skill sets, and I wouldn't expect one person to have the full range of skills. And so I think that modelers understand one very important piece of it, and then that needs to sort of work up the chain. I think that having, like everything that Gary said, like having those existing relationships, having people who are advocates, who are good communicators. I'm part of a health coalition in Pennsylvania, and we have all of these different players, right? So we have our data people who are trying to figure out, what is the state of affairs. We have our advocacy people who, interact with decision makers and have ongoing relationships with them, right? And then bring important information. So I think it's really a team effort.
I once was told something like this, that decision makers, this was from the president of a company, he says, we want advice from trusted colleagues. So how do you become a trusted colleague whose advice has been reliable and dependable for the decision makers?
Well, if you think about like a state legislature or a department of health, or something along those lines, right? You have a relationship with them. You go and you talk to their staffers regularly. You find out what's important to them, and you speak their language. Their language is not data. These are people, right? And so you speak that language.
And you learn to play golf, because that's where the decisions are going to get made.
Yeah.
And I think just a comment. I think in an ideal world, that's exactly what you would do. Nathaniel Osgood and I had a meeting with David McDwyer in the National Health Service a couple of weeks ago, just to talk about this and what they're doing. And it's pretty clear they're still in crisis mode there, and they haven't got time to build relationships or play golf or anything. The National Health Service is balanced on a knife edge between utter collapse, not just from the shock they've had from COVID, but they're dealing with a huge backlog of people whose operations have been delayed, and also this now eruption of long COVID, and people who are in absolute despair because they don't know when it's going to end. And that's affecting the healthcare workers and reducing the capacity of the healthcare system. So in an ideal world, yes, we have this luxury of time to build these relationships and do all that. But, sometimes you just haven't got the time. And the question, I think the question for this is my personal estimate of how long we've got to try and stamp on this is about 18 months. And otherwise, we're stuck with something like the opioid crisis, and it's that serious. So, that's why, if we wait for the NHS to get into a situation here in the UK where they're ready to deal with this, probably going to be too late. So we need to think of some innovations that speed it up and do workarounds, and maybe approaching the world of business, which is where I come from, to get them engaged and just say, okay, actually the people that are being affected by this are the ones we want to put to work, and there's a shortage of them right now. We got to do something about this.
So a question from a skeptical and overworked and underwater executive in a health care policy setting. Wouldn't they ask you, Maurice, how do you know you're right?
Yeah, and the short answer to that is I have no way to know that I'm right. I've just put together some data, and it's highlighted a really big risk that we should put some effort into assessing in more detail, because if it happens the way we've shown here, we're in for some really unpleasant situation that will drop the quality of life for society as a whole by significant margin.
I think
maybe,
you have to.
Maybe it won't happen.
I think too, though, you have to understand the context, which is a lot of leaders have gotten burned by our models.
Oh yeah.
Very recently about COVID specifically, and we have had a lot of models that were not right.
Absolutely, yeah. And that's actually why I think Saskatchewan is such a great example, because they had a lot of success. Looking at how they did that is worth paying attention to.
I have to go. I'm sorry.
Deb, thanks for coming.
Thank you. Wonderful
Thank you.
work. Thank you so much for sharing.
Thank you for coming.
So what would it take if we wanted to follow up with the Saskatchewan and learn more about the secret sauce there? What would be the right way? Would we try to get Nate to come? Would we try to get his colleague to come and share her perspective? How could we, as in our unit, go a little bit further in looking at this impact question?
Yeah, I think if you could get both Nate and Jenny to talk to you about what they've done, that's a good next step. They are they've found some sort of symbiosis between them that we could all learn from. And they're, I think, just it'd be fascinating for you. I know it is for me. That I've seen some of the early results from the survey. Just maybe invite them to show you what they're discovering in their long COVID survey.
Is there like one last question? We're just about at the time, and it's good to finish on time, so because people have other things perhaps. But if there was one more question, we probably have time for it.
I was just going to give as an example of that trusted relationship, the Georgia Health Policy Institute, Karen Minyard's group, which has this long-term relationship, I think, with the legislature. It's involved a lot of training as well as working on particular policy issues. And it sounds like there's a similar kind of set of relationships in Saskatchewan as well. But it's building up that relationship over time, serving some very real needs, and sort of educating the decision makers about, sort of the systemic effects of particular problems. So they're not looking at things in silos.
So that, would that be another potential? I'm not saying we need to focus all of our attention on this particular issue, but that might be another group to reach out to potentially. I'll work with you offline, Gary.
Yeah, I would think so. If we're looking at how to have impact, that would, be interesting to hear their story.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'm going to go ahead and say one more time, thank you very much, Maurice and Costas, for suggesting this particular talk. And then I'll go ahead and close the room and let us get on to the rest of our day. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Yes, thank you.
Okay, thanks very much for organizing this meeting, and also just a quick shout out to the key people that supported, including Kim Warren and Joanna Barros, who worked with me at various stages, and I've already mentioned Nathaniel Osgood and Jenny Basran, and thanks to you, Wayne, for helping me get ready.
Well, see some of you at the conference coming up in July.
Before you go, if you don't mind sending the presentation or slide deck to the
Yeah,
email
sure. Okay.
that'd be greatly appreciated.
Yeah, I'll share it with Wayne, and he can distribute it to the group.
We'll figure out how to get it posted on our Health Policy SIG website somehow. I'm still working on trying to get that website to be useful. So, and we have a lot of support with the society. They're going through that. So yeah, Ross, we'll get that posted, and just don't hesitate to ping me down the road a little bit and say, where is that? If nothing else, I can just send it to you. Okay.
Sounds good. Thank you.
All right. Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Have a great
Thanks, Gary.
afternoon,
Your
evening,
turn.
whatever it is for you.
Okay, bye-bye.
I think.
It's just us now.
Oh, okay.
I just stopped I just